I always found one of the most odd parts about that story is Jesus' reaction to Peter. After he sinks and Jesus picks him up and he says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And that seems really odd to me because he had enough faith that he got out of the boat. I don't see the other 11 getting out of the boat. Like, why so harsh on Peter? But it made me think, like, I want you to think about a time where, and specifically a time where you felt really close to God. Like you and God just felt like you were on the same page, like it was so close where you could almost audibly hear him speak. You could physically feel his presence and knew exactly what he wanted for you. Anybody have those moments? Don't you wish all moments were like that? Shoo! Now think about a time when God felt so distant from you that felt like his voice was silent, his presence was absent, and you had no idea which way to turn. Anybody have any of those moments? Aren't you glad they're not the only moments we have? I remember when we lived in California, I was part of the church choir, because we still had church choirs back then. And we were doing a devotional before choir rehearsal, and the subject of God's presence and stuff came up. And one of the choir members stood up and talked about going to camp and hearing one of the camp counselors or leaders at a camp say this. Said that when God feels distant, it's not God who's moved. And my mom, who was singing in the choir, because that's what my mom does. Even now when church choirs aren't around, she finds a way to find a church choir and sing in it. But my mom got up and actually piped up and said, "No, I don't think that's always the case." I love my mom. I think she's right. It's a clever thought that if we feel distant from God, that it's not God who moved. But I don't think it's as sound as it sounds. Granted, God does not often feel far from us because we're hiding from him. Sorry, let me say that again. Granted, God does sometimes feel distant from us because we're hiding from it. We've separated and walked away, but that's not universally true. There are times where God creates that distance not to get away from us, but to call us deeper and further in and getting us to chase after him. He moves so that we will follow. So what is really happening in those places? Those moments when we feel close to God and we feel distant to God. What is really happening? And I think what's really happening in those places is really an issue of attunement. Specifically, how well are we attuning to God? Because if God is creating distance so that we will follow, then if we're still attuned to him, that won't feel like distance, that'll feel like leading. But if we're not attuned, then that distance feels like he's leaving us. And so the question becomes, are we shifting our inner self in order to align and resonate with God's reality? Peter personifies this attunement and some of this difficulty in Matthew 14. Jesus had just fed the 5,000. Here's kind of the context. Jesus had just performed the feeding of the 5,000, and they've wrapped that up. And so he sends the disciples out in the boat to go out into the other side, and he's going to dismiss the crowd, and then he's going to go up to pray, and so he's going to be in isolation for a while. So the disciples go in the boat, and while they're in the boat, the storm rolls in. Like, we live on the bay. How, you ever been in, like, out in a boat and just all of a sudden the storm rolls in? It's like, where'd this come from? So that's what happens. They're on the boat, storm comes in, and it pushes the boat farther and farther from shore. And the disciples don't really have a way to get back, because this is most likely some kind of sailboat. And so if any of you are familiar with sailboats, you don't keep the sail up during a storm. You bring it down. And so there's really no way to steer or drive the boat or sail it anywhere because the storm's going on. You got to wait till it passes. And so they're getting pushed further and further from the shore. And suddenly, Jesus appears on the water walking toward them. Now, not to, state the obvious, but I don't think the disciples expected to see anybody there out on the water. And I confess that when I read this, I sometimes wonder, was Jesus walking at a certain depth and the waves are still washing over, but he's still walking like it's flat, or is he bouncing with the waves? I don't know. I'm curious. But they see him out there and they're not expecting anybody to be there. And so it really freaks them out. Again, I don't want to state the obvious. It would freak me out if I saw somebody standing out on the water. So they see him and they think, it's a ghost. Because, to be honest, so far that's the most sane thing that would be happening right now. It's a ghost. But Jesus calls out and says, take courage. I am here. How many times in our storms do we need Jesus to call out to us, hey, take courage. I'm here. And Peter, blessed Peter, says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out to you. Which seems like a really ridiculous request. And Jesus responds, I love the way you read that, Sandy. Just okay, come on out. And Peter does. Peter says, Lord, if it's you, come out. So Jesus does, and so Peter does. And Peter's walking out on the water toward Jesus. I think that's where Peter starts to attune to Jesus. He's in the storm and he sees Jesus, and Jesus says, take heart, I am here. So Peter gives Jesus his attention. He starts aligning and attuning himself to Jesus. Lord, if that is you, call me to come out. Command me to come out, and I'll come. And so Jesus says, it's me, come on out. And Peter's focus is entirely attuned to Jesus, so he gets out of the boat. But it's not long before Peter's attunement to Jesus is broken. The storm steals his focus. And he starts to sink and cries out, Lord, save me. It's not that he's forgotten that Jesus is there. It's not that Jesus has wandered off somewhere else. Jesus is still where he was, but Peter's attention has been stolen. His focus has been severed from Jesus, so he calls out, Lord, save me. And Jesus picks him up. And that's where he says, look, why did you doubt? The issue isn't, he's not criticizing him above the other disciples, because Lord knows they didn't get out of the boat. But Peter got out of the boat because he was attuned to Jesus. And the doubt was, why did you let your focus go to the storm? Because your focus was on me. It was your fear and your doubt that stole it. Here we see both the benefits and the consequences of both attunement and misattunement. When Peter attunes to who Jesus is, Peter does what Jesus is doing. When Peter attunes to who Jesus is, he is able to do what Jesus does. Peter was able to walk on water. Notice while the storm is still raging. Jesus' presence didn't automatically calm the storm, didn't cease the waves from crashing around. Instead, Peter began to sink because he stopped attuning. The raging storm stole Peter's focus, and it was no longer attuned to Jesus. Attuning to Jesus won't remove the storms. Attuning to Jesus won't calm the seas. It's not going to suddenly make life smooth sailing just because you've accepted Jesus as Savior. Just because you've given your allegiance to the kingdom doesn't mean life will be smooth sailing. I think we have enough people in here that have experienced life with Jesus enough to know that's not true. Nor will Jesus wait for the storm to pass. How many times do we think, if I can just get through this moment or through this part of my life, or if I can just get this stuff ready, then I'll give all my attention to Jesus. Jesus doesn't wait for the storm to pass. Peter had to attune to Jesus in the midst of the storm. Doesn't wait for Jesus to calm the storm and say, okay, now that all the distractions are gone, now I can focus on you. Jesus isn't going to wait for that. We need to learn to attune to Jesus even when the chaos swirls around us. The only thing that must shift is our inner self. Peter's perspective changes. The storm didn't matter anymore once Peter was attuned to Jesus. The waves didn't matter anymore once Peter was attuned to Jesus. The thunder and the lightning didn't matter to Peter anymore once he was attuned to Jesus. The wind didn't matter anymore because he was attuned to Jesus. Until it mattered again. And Peter's focus shifted. And he was misattuned with Jesus and reattuning to the storm. There are at least two of our axioms at work here in this passage. And the first is that God meets us in reality. Wherever real life is happening, in the middle of the storm, in the midst of a pandemic, or even during our most mundane moments, that's where God is attuning to us. We don't wait for the circumstances to improve, for life to slow down. We attune in the midst of it, right in the middle of our life. And that is true of all of us, but especially young parents. Because we have these children that run around that demand our attention, that are always trying to stick their fingers in light sockets or pull heavy objects off shelves down onto their heads. It's like there's some suicidal tendency in us as children that are like, let's see how many ways I can injure myself. And if it's not something external, it's like a fixation they have. Like Wesley loves to chew on his fingers and toes. And it's like he'll just chew them down to till he chews enough layer of skin off that it hurts. And then we got to put a Band-Aid. Then he wants us to put a little Band-Aid on his finger, but he's chewed the tip. Do you know how hard it is to put a Band-Aid on the tip of a finger? And I don't know how many times we have to tell him, stop chewing your fingers or your toes. I can't even get my foot in my mouth, but he can and chews his toes the same way. It's like we're going to have to start dipping your fingers and toes in hot sauce. But all that attention, like as parents, we have all that attention that's divided and stolen. And yet God is not, it's like God isn't like, I'll leave you over here on hold until you get to a point of life where you can attune back to me. God is standing there saying, hey, midst of this chaos, it's okay. I'm still here. Take courage. But attune to me. Attune to me, and all this chaos won't matter. It won't affect you. You'll be able to walk through the storm and walk on the waves. The second axiom that's at work is that our goal is divine union. Our goal is to be totally and completely attuned to God. And He with us. We want that attunement to work, go two ways, right? Now here's the good news. God will keep up his end. He will attune to us. Will we fulfill our end? As God attunes to us, his inner self will shift to resonate with our inner world. Jesus is not divorced from the concerns the disciples have about the storm. He's not ignorant of their worries. He's with them in it. He's there. He gets it. God meets us in reality. And then we can respond by attuning back to God, allowing our inner self to shift to resonate with God's reality, aligning our reality to his. When these two axioms become true in us, that we're going to meet God wherever we are, but where we actually are, not in those places we'd like to be, but in the places we actually are. When we attune to God there, and then when we seek that attunement as our goal, then we will become like Peter, attuning to Jesus to do what Jesus does. Imagine a world where Christians all over the world were attuned to Jesus the way Peter was in Matthew 14. Imagine the world. Even if, not even if all the world became Christian, just imagine if those of us that profess to be such were that attuned to Jesus to be able to do what Jesus did and think how different this world could be. When I was preparing this sermon, I was actually looking at a different text. I was actually going to read the story of Mary anointing the feet of Jesus. That's another great story of someone attuning to Jesus and responding to that. And as I was doing work for that, I was looking up the idea of us attuning to God. And I came across a favorite theologian of Christians everywhere, C.S. Lewis. And I read a story from C.S. Lewis that changed the text. And I read the story and I went, that's like Peter on the water. How many of you have read the Chronicles of Narnia? See a lot of head nodding and some hands raised. In the actual second published work is the story of Prince Caspian. How many of you read The Magician's Nephew first? Okay, you guys did it wrong. The first book, I'm just kidding. Actually, C.S. Lewis actually published them and wrote them in such a way that it didn't matter what order you read them. He didn't really have an order you had to read them in. But the way I read them was is in the order of when they were published, which starts with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then The Magician's Nephew is actually at the end. It's the last book that was published. The way Sandy and Pastor Karen read, they read according to the chronological order, in the order in which things happen, and The Magician's Nephew comes first. I digress. Look at how much I've matured. I'm letting this argument go. So in this book, the Pevensey children, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, are on their second journey into Narnia. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe's their first, and they basically lived like an entire lifetime there, and then find their way coming back out the wardrobe, and time in the real world has hardly passed. And so in the second book now, this is their second journey back into Narnia. And of the four, Lucy is consistently the one that is the most interested in attuning to Aslan. There's something about Lucy that is always looking for the lion. And when they come back, it's a long time before Aslan actually shows up. And their journey, they've gotten with this dwarf because it's the Chronicles of Narnia, and they're traveling through, and there's a little bit of sense of they don't recognize everything because time passes differently in Narnia than it does in here. So even though it's like they could live a whole lifetime there and come back and been a few seconds, and then a year later they go back and like thousands of years in Narnia have passed. And so the landscape seems just different enough that they can't quite place where they are. So they're wandering through Narnia, and they get to this place along a gorge where there's two roads they can take. They can go up one side, or they can go down the other. And they don't know which way to go. And they're sitting there and they're having a discussion about which way to go. And Lucy all of a sudden pipes up and says, "Aslan!" And she sees him. Everybody else looks, nobody else sees him. She looks back, he's not there. So she sees him for just like this really brief moment. And she says, "I saw him, and he wants us to go that way." But nobody else sees him, and they're skeptical. And that way doesn't look like the right way. So they say, "No, we're not going to go that way." They go the other direction. And Lucy, just really upset, goes with them. And it ends up that the way they go puts them in like serious danger and puts them in a real tough spot. So they end up having to go back and go the way Lucy tried to get them before. The whole time she was saying, "I saw him, he wanted us to go this way." It's kind of this nice little "I told you so" moment. So they get back to the spot where they had to make that decision, but by now it's dark and they have to go to sleep. And so they're all camped, they're sleeping, and Lucy awakens because she hears a voice say her name. And I kind of love it. C.S. Lewis says she hears it, and it sounds like her father, but not quite, but not exactly. It's like it gives the impression that it's her dad, but it's not. And so she gets up and starts looking for the voice. And as she wanders through the wilderness, the trees actually move to create a path for her. And she ends up in a clearing, and there in the clearing is Aslan. And I want you to listen to this encounter that Lucy has with Aslan, and listen to the attunement that C.S. Lewis writes in this story. For a time, she was so happy that she did not want to speak. But Aslan spoke. "Lucy," he said, "we must not lie here for long. You have work in hand, and much time has been lost today." Because they went the wrong way, remember? "Yes, wasn't it a shame?" said Lucy. "I saw you all right. They wouldn't believe me. They're all so..." From somewhere deep inside Aslan's body, there came the faintest suggestion of a growl. "I'm sorry," said Lucy, who understood some of his moods. "I didn't mean to start slinging the others, but it wasn't my fault anyway, was it?" The lion looked straight into her eyes. "Oh, Aslan," said Lucy, "you don't mean it was? How could I? I couldn't have left the others and come up to you alone. How could I? Don't look at me like that." "Oh, well, I suppose I could. Yes, and I wouldn't have been alone, I know, not if I was with you, but what would have been the good?" Aslan said nothing. "You mean," said Lucy rather faintly, "that it would have turned out all right? Somehow? But how? Please, Aslan, tell me. Am I not to know?" "To know what would have happened, child?" said Aslan. "No, nobody has ever told that." "Oh dear," said Lucy. "But anyone can find out what will happen. If you go back to the others now and wake them up and tell them you have seen me again and that you must all get up at once and follow me, what will happen? There's only one way of finding out." "Do you mean that is what you want me to do?" gasped Lucy. "Yes, little one," said Aslan. "Will the others see you too?" asked Lucy. "Certainly not at first," said Aslan. "Later on, it depends." "But they won't believe me," said Lucy. "It doesn't matter," said Aslan. Oh dear," said Lucy. "And I was so pleased at finding you again, and I thought you'd let me stay, and I thought you'd come roaring in and frightening all the enemies away like last time, and now everything is going to be horrid." "It is hard for you, little one," said Aslan. But things never happen the same way twice. It has been hard for us all in Narnia before. Lucy buried her head in his mane to hide from his face, but there must have been some magic in his mane. She could feel lion strength going into her. Quite suddenly, she sat up. "I'm sorry, Aslan," she said. "I'm ready now." "Now you are a lioness," said Aslan, "and now all Narnia will be renewed. But come, we have no time to lose." I love how much attunement that C.S. Lewis gives Lucy in that conversation where there's that whole part where she has this whole conversation with Aslan, and Aslan's not saying or doing anything. He's just sitting there, and she's like, "Well, certainly it's not my fault." "Oh, it is my fault. But what would have been the good?" "But no, that's not," and Aslan's not, and it even says, because she knows some of his moods. How does she know his moods if not for that he attunes? She attunes to him. Lucy ends up going on and does struggle to wake the others because they are tired. It's been a long day and they're getting woken from their sleep, and she tries to get them, she wants them to come follow her, and they don't want to. She says, "I see him." She actually still sees him. And nobody else can see him. None of her other siblings can see them. But they follow. And one by one, all the children begin to see Aslan on the journey. So at first they have to follow Lucy, who's following Aslan. She's attuned to him. She can see them. As long as they're misattuned, they don't get to see him. But as the journey goes, just the act of following the one who's following Aslan helps them attune so that they start to see the lion. Edmund's first, and then Peter, and last is Susan. And I think Susan's interactions give us hope, especially for those of us who struggle to attune to God. Because here's this interaction. We've gotten to hear how Lucy, who's already seems to be the one who's most attuned to Aslan, and how Aslan responds to her. This is now Susan, who's always the last one to attune. So Susan sees the lion now. And she goes up to Lucy and she says, "Lucy," said Susan in a very small voice. "Yes," said Lucy. "I see him now. I'm sorry." "That's all right. But I've been far worse than you know. I really believed it was him. Yesterday. When he warned us not to go down to the fir wood. And I really believed it was him tonight when you woke us up. Deep on the inside, or at least I could have if I'd let myself. But I just wanted to get out of the woods. And I don't know. And whatever am I to say to him?" "Perhaps you won't need to say much," suggested Lucy. "Oh, Aslan," said King Peter, dropping on one knee and raising the lion's heavy paw to his face. "I'm so glad, and I'm so sorry I've been leading them wrong ever since we started, and especially yesterday morning." "My dear son," said Aslan. Then he turned and welcomed Edmund. "Well done," were his words. Then, after an awful pause, the deep voice said, "Susan." Susan made no answer, but the others thought she was crying. "You have listened to fears, child," said Aslan. "Come, let me breathe on you. Forget them. Are you brave again?" "A little, Aslan," said Susan. Even though Susan had failed over and over and over again to attune to Aslan, his response was not one of condemnation or exclusion or criticism. He simply said, "You've listened to fears. Let me breathe on you." When Susan finally attunes enough to Aslan to see him, he attunes to her. God is calling us, like Lucy, to lead the way along unseen paths. It's the way of Jesus, to do what Jesus did, to say what Jesus said, to love how Jesus loved. And this way won't be found on our own. It won't be done under our own power. It will require us to attune to God and trust His leading. But the good news is that when we attune to who Jesus is, we can do what Jesus did.
Thank you for being part of our online family. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you get notifications for any future videos or content. And feel free to please share with a friend. You can also follow us on Facebook or Instagram. And if you feel so inclined and would like to donate and support our ministry, please click the donate button found in the description. Thank you, and God bless you.